Ladies and gentlemen, today I have the pleasure to welcome Mr. Ben Bayer. Mr. Ben Bayer is a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. Mr. Ben Bayer, thank you very much for joining me under the Human Rights Tree.
Thanks for having me, Alpha.
Yeah, before we start talking about the subject, Ayn Rand views on human rights, you don't mind just tell me a little bit about your background?
Sure. Well, the basics are that I am currently what you call a fellow and director of content at the Ayn Rand Institute. Ayn Rand Institute is a nonprofit educational foundation that is devoted to educating people about the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was a novelist and philosopher. She wrote books like Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, which were great renown in the middle of the 20th century, continue to be read by millions of people today. I've been working for ARI for about 6 years now, and before that I was a college philosophy professor at a variety of different schools around the country. Did that for maybe 10 years before I decided to come to work at ARI. Basically, as long as I've been involved in professional philosophy, my approach has always been informed by the ideas of Ayn Rand, and so I was very happy to come to work at the Institute, where I get to basically do that full time.
I see. Do you recall the first time you encounter Ayn Rand ideas?
Sure. It's around the same time as I think most people do who've heard of her. Most people hear about her books when they're young in high school. Same was true for me, though it was a bit of an individualized twist in my case. When I was in high school, I was an interscholastic debater.
Okay.
And so we travel around to different debate tournaments and debate different topics of political and philosophical interest. There was, in particular, when I was in this category called Lincoln Douglas debate, which was more philosophical, I would often have to read different philosophers to find out different positions on moral and political questions. And even before I had read any Ayn Rand, I read a number of different philosophers. I hadn't read her yet, but I heard her name come up in rounds. I heard people quoting from this book of hers called Philosophy, Who Needs It?, which at the time I thought was some kind of dismissive title, like as if nobody needs philosophy. So I checked it out at the Barnes & Noble, and it turned out, no, there's no question mark in that title. It's Philosophy, Who Needs It, period, as though, because she's saying, here are the people who need philosophy. And she thought the answer was everybody. And I thought that was an intriguing position. I had picked up the book, and also in part because I knew she criticized a number of the philosophers whose arguments I would use in my debate rounds. And so I wanted to know what the arguments were. But by the time I got through the first chapter of the book, I was already intrigued about her own perspective. Though she wasn't doing a lot in that first chapter of Philosophy, Who Needs It, to explain what her philosophy was explicitly. She was explaining why philosophy generally is so important. And she argued that everyone has a philosophy, that you can't avoid philosophy. You'll form views on it one way or the other. Your only choice is which views are you going to form, and it matters if your views are rational, consistent, principled, or on the one hand, versus garbled, incoherent, accepted passively on the other. So that got me interested in her as a thinker. I didn't yet know a lot about what her views were. I found out more about them by reading her fiction first with The Fountainhead. That was the one that really changed my mind about a lot of things. And then eventually the other novels and nonfiction I gobbled up very quickly after that.
So what is Ayn Rand philosophy for the people who don't know her?
Yes, well, she called her philosophy objectivism, and that's objectivism with a capital O. It's important because there are a lot of other positions called objectivist with lowercase o's in philosophy, and hers is very different from those, and it would take a while to explain why. But for her, she wanted to give a definite name to her philosophy, and that was the one that emerged. And I can tell you more about what it stands for.
Okay, you say her philosophy was objectivism, that differentiate her from other philosophers. So what are the premises? What are the general idea of objectivism?
Well, let me answer this question just by reading you one brief quotation from Ayn Rand, where she answers that same question just in one sentence. She says, "My philosophy, in essence, is the concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute." So the reason she called it objectivism, from what I understand, is that it has to do with that last point in the quotation, reason is his only absolute. That means she thinks the only way we know the world, the only way we know anything about reality is by observing it with our senses and processing the data of our senses using our minds, using our rational minds. And that gives us knowledge of all of the other things there are to know, including in philosophy, where she thinks you can then have objective knowledge of facts about the world, facts about human nature, including facts about questions of value. And so we can have objective knowledge of what is objectively valuable to human life. And then on the basis of that, even come up with theories about what an objectively properly constructed society would look like.
So as we know, Miss Iron is no more, but there is a institute that are here to advocate her legacy. Would you mind explaining a little bit what the Iron Institute stands for, and
Yes.
what is also its raison d'être?
Well, our main purpose, our main mission is education.
Okay.
Ayn Rand's own view, and we may talk about this a little more today still, was that history is driven by ideas, that it's not primarily a battle of political wills or just great men exerting their will against each other, that it's ideas that drive the course of history. The things that people believe to be true about the world is what motivates them to act. And so if you want to change the world for the better, you need to educate people philosophically. And so our major mission is in line with that. It's philosophical education. And we've undertaken that mission in a number of different ways down through the years. It was originally founded in the early 1980s, and we've sponsored essay contests about Ayn Rand's novels. It was actually one of those essay contests that motivated me to read The Fountainhead in the first place. We have speakers who travel around the world, who go to conferences. We host conferences. Right now, our main focus, what we're directing most of our energies toward and targeting with all of our other programs, is something called the Ayn Rand University, and it's more or less what it sounds like. It's a way to take college level classes about philosophy generally and about Ayn Rand's philosophy in particular, along with other courses in the humanities that examine science, literature, etc., through the lens of objectivist philosophy. And so it's not an accredited university, but it is online, and we take students from all over the world, all walks of life, and we're growing rapidly.
So is a virtual university, you mean, or do you collaborate with other universities to teach Iron ideas?
Right now, it is just a virtual university, but who knows what the future may hold.
Okay, so what are your future ambitions, goals, beside only teaching her ideas? Do you plan to have branches all around the world, or you just want to focus on teaching?
Uh, well, we are definitely primarily focused on teaching, but
Okay.
the reason to teach is that the point that I mentioned before, that I mean, we think that ideas make a difference in people's lives. And so one of the things that's our major focus right now is teaching people not just what you might call theoretical knowledge, book knowledge. We are doing a lot to help people learn how to put those ideas into practice. We have more practically oriented courses. We have a coaching program where people are coached to use these ideas to improve their professional careers and ambitions. And we have a global reach. We give conferences. We do conferences all over the world where we try to recruit new students, and we have students from all over the world, and some of them will start up local clubs or chapters if they like to, but that's really up to them, depending on what value they see to it. Um, some of our students are studying to be professional intellectuals, which means they want to become college professors or political leaders or activists or journalists. Others are ones we call intellectual professionals who maybe aren't going to be in the business of ideas. They're not going to be writing or speaking or teaching about these ideas, but where they're working in industries that use these ideas. And so they need to be very clear in their thinking about them. And here I'm thinking about uh, professions like science and medicine and the law and certainly politics.
As an institute, I believe that you have a goals, and often by implementing your goal, do you face challenges? And if you are facing challenges, what are those challenges?
Well, yeah, we certainly face a lot of challenges. It was maybe a little hard to get it just from that very, very brief statement of what her philosophy is. But if I were to say just a little more about it, you'd see, your audience would see just how controversial this philosophy is. So, the concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life. Well, that's another way of saying that you should be concerned with the pursuit of your own happiness, your own selfish happiness. And that's an idea that runs up against 2,000 years of Judeo-Christian morality, which has long stressed that no, there's no moral worth in the pursuit of your self-interest. What really matters in life is how you sacrifice yourself to serve other people. And so then that has pretty important implications for politics, whether you think something like self-interest and the pursuit of happiness or selfless service, whether you think that's the standard of morality. It makes the difference between whether you think something like laissez-faire capitalism is an ideal social system as opposed to a kind of collectivist socialist system. So Rand is on the side of individualism, individual rights, and capitalism because of her conviction that one's own pursuit of happiness has moral significance and is one's moral purpose. So that's a controversial idea that puts us up against almost everybody else in the world and in the history of ideas. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges.
Yeah, but basically, when you say is controversial, me personally, I used to see it as a controversial, but after reading her work, I see it as more natural because it's the way we act on. each person often, even though you come from a family, often you have your own ideas, you have your own path. And I believe that she's showing us something that is reflect the truth that we, in one way or another, don't want to recognize or are not willing to recognize because of the influence of other factors that affect our life, our parents' life, our grandparents' life. And I think saying a person should seek her on his or her own happiness is, I think this is quite natural. You don't think so?
Well, there's something natural about it, and you're definitely right that there can be things that are truths that people refuse to see for any number of reasons. That's, of course, part of where the controversy comes from, is because there are a lot of reasons why people don't want to accept the truths that she argued for. But one other thing is, maybe I'm not quite sure what you mean by natural, but sometimes people think the reason that either why they think she's obviously right or obviously wrong is because they think what she's saying is that we all pursue our self-interest and our happiness naturally, in the sense of we do it automatically. We can't help but do it. Everybody is always selfish, no matter what they do, even if they tell themselves otherwise. And that's a view that she rejected. So she didn't agree with what they call a psychological egoism, the idea that everyone is in fact selfish. She thinks people make real choices, sometimes to the detriment of their interests, and sometimes consciously to the detriment of their own interests. And she thought that was a really wicked thing to do, but that people still do it. And it's part of the reason why she thinks it's her position needs to be argued for and supported, is to try to convince people to make better choices. And I mean, her position isn't that everybody is selfish, but that everybody ought to pursue their self-interest, that they ought to do it, and that it takes work. And the other issue is that it's one reason it's not natural is just that, I mean, if you interpret natural as easy, she thinks pursuing your happiness is very difficult, that it's not something that you know obviously how to do. You're just born knowing how to do, that it takes work and thinking, and it takes new discoveries about yourself and about the world to figure out what values to pursue to actually add up to a healthy, happy life.
On that, what is her views on human rights?
Human rights. Well, this is a topic that's a term that's right at the title of your show. So I'm glad you asked about it. So I'll start by saying, just as a consequence of some of these other ideas that we've talked about, the idea of the importance of the pursuit of happiness, she was a prominent and vocal advocate for the idea of individual rights, where she's talking about the kinds of rights that are named in the Declaration of Independence, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And she thought that if you really take that idea of individual rights seriously, and you understand it consistently in terms of principle, that this means, for one thing, it means the kind of intellectual freedoms that we see protected in the First Amendment, like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom of religion. But it also means economic freedom. It means the right to trade with other people without anyone's interference. If you're consenting adults, you can exchange value for value to mutual benefit. And so what this means for her is two things. One is, because she defends intellectual freedom, it means, for instance, separation of church and state, which most people associate with that First Amendment. But it also means separation of state and economy. And the way she put it was, for the same reasons as the separation of state and church, because she thinks that we can expand on this later, but just like you need to be free to pursue the truth, to figure out your own vision of happiness, and you need to be able to speak freely and agree and disagree with people about ideas, the mind also needs freedom to create values, material values in the world. And so there needs to be both kinds of freedom. And the reason this relates to your question about human rights is that, well, I mean, we could speak loosely and say all the rights that I just described are human rights, because they're rights that we have in virtue of being individual human beings. And there wouldn't be any problem with that phrase if it weren't for the fact that it's used very differently by many people, differently from what she means, at least. So, for example, there are a lot of people who will talk about human rights and count the kinds of intellectual freedoms that I was just talking about. So they'll see free speech and freedom of the press and freedom of religion. They'll see those are human rights, but they won't recognize something like a businessman's right to be free from regulations, or a citizen's right to be free from having his or her wealth expropriated. They won't see those as human rights. They'll say those are just property rights, not human rights. So they see human rights as, in effect, rights for the downtrodden, and they don't think, people who use it this way at least, don't see people who have wealth, let's say, or ability, that their right to protect their property doesn't count as a human right. And sometimes they'll even argue that we have human rights to violate the property rights of others, as in, for example, the conversation that we have in this country about the right to health care. So if you have a right to health care, that's considered to be a human right, and it means that you have the right to have other people pay for your medical care. And so Ayn Rand would have criticized that viewpoint, and so to the extent that the language of human rights is used to represent that viewpoint, that's where she took issue with it. If it hadn't been used that way, she probably would have been fine with saying, yes, these individual rights that I advocate are, of course, human rights, but it's often used to mean something very different than what she meant by rights.
But when you come to, for instance, healthcare, the right, if people, you believe that Ayn Rand doesn't stand for the right to healthcare because people are paying for it, if I understand your ideas. But when you come to healthcare, I have been studying about it and trying to write about it. I come through the view that the government, when it come every year on the month of April, they come and they demand that we pay them money every year. And this is not, they don't ask, it's not a question if you want or not. So they come and they say, as a citizen, you should pay your taxes. And for me, when it comes to using that money, is it preferable to use that money to take care of the health of their population, or you think it's better to use that money and get involved on other strategic power struggle? What do you think?
Well, the first thing to say is that the first thing you said about the way government money is actually collected is very important to recognize. That is, taxes are something we don't have a choice about, that they are coercively expropriated from us. We can't object to it or we'll go to prison. And that's the fundamental reason why she was opposed to all kinds of government programs that involved redistribution, including healthcare. I'll say one more thing, though, which is that she was very principled about this. She didn't think anything should be funded by taxes. and including the things that aren't exactly redistribution. So she didn't think, for instance, that the military or the police should be funded through taxes. She thought there should still be a military and a police force. She thought they should be funded by voluntary donations, and how that's possible is a whole long conversation. But she thought that in a free society, government should be funded voluntarily, and she thought there were lots of ways to do it. Now, it's a fair question, I think, to ask, supposing that they are taking these taxes from us, what are better things to do with them? And here, I think what she would normally say was, well, the government should still try to restrict itself as best as possible to what she saw as the necessary and legitimate functions of government, which were the protection of individual rights. And what that means is protecting people from coercion, the coercion of others. So protecting you from criminals by funding a police force, protecting us from foreign invasion by funding a military, protecting us all to work under a rule of law by funding a court system. And yeah, the government as it currently is set up to do many, many other things which she wouldn't agree with. I think her view would be you should work to progressively eliminate the functions that don't fit with that basic purpose of government. Mm-hmm. And I should also say that none of this is to say anything about if your taxes go to fund a healthcare system, that you should in any way feel guilty about using Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. She was very much on record saying, since you didn't have any choice about your taxes being taken, you shouldn't feel guilty at all about using government benefits. It's a way of getting some compensation for what was taken from you. But she still didn't think it should be understood in terms of a right to healthcare, because that a right to anything implies an obligation on somebody else's part. And what it means in practice is a right for somebody else, a right to demand that somebody else pay for your goods and services. And she didn't think anyone had that obligation, that we only have an obligation in effect to pursue our own happiness and not to be forced to help somebody else.
Coming to that, we know we live in a world that is constantly changing. In which way you think through the Ayn Rand Institute, you think Ayn Rand idea should or are changing based on the reality today?
Well, I don't know if her ideas are changing, because of course they're her ideas and she's not around to change them anymore in response to new things she observes. But so are you asking how would her ideas apply to new situations that we observe today?
Considering the fact you are here has been the voice of Ayn Rand, and now, of course, her time and our time are not the same. So having the work of representing Ayn Rand, being her voice, are you still only applying theoretically what she's saying, or are you trying in many ways to take her idea and trying to fit it to the new realities?
Well, precisely because I am here, and I wouldn't say I'm a representative of her ideas. I work for an institute that's dedicated to her ideas, but she can only speak for herself. So people who want to learn more about what she said should read her books. But we do try to educate people about her ideas. But her ideas are what they are, and they don't change as the social reality around us changes. I think the way they apply to the world around us does change, because new situations come up, and you have to intelligently apply these same ideas to these kinds of new situations.
I'm sorry to interrupt. So I may rephrase how they apply now.
Okay.
So maybe this is the essence of my question: how her ideas can apply to the actual realities. Yeah.
Sure. So the the general idea that she had was that ideas move the world, and she had a certain set of ideas that she thought were good, that would move the world in a better direction, and she observed there were a lot of bad ideas that she thought moved us in a worse direction. And since she died in 1982, the world has changed a lot. I mean, I would say one thing we observed was the collapse of communism. And she was herself a refugee from the Soviet Union and was a critic of communism that goes along with being a champion of capitalism. I think she probably would have felt rather vindicated by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communist world, because she knew that these systems didn't work. At the same time, even though those systems collapsed because they couldn't produce economically, they've in most cases not been replaced by anything much better. I mean, we see this in Russia today, where communism was replaced by a brutal authoritarian regime that's now aggressively invading its neighbors. And so there's a lot to learn there about the role of ideas in history, because you can disqualify one bad idea, but unless you replace it with an actually better one, people will default into other bad ideas. And I think here, in the case of Russia, for instance, there was never really any concerted effort to in Russia to adopt universalist Enlightenment ideas. They never really, there was never really an effort to adopt the idea of individual rights, for instance. And so they defaulted into, rather than communism, into something like nationalist collectivism, which is explicitly what's motivating the war between Russia and Ukraine right now. So there are different bad ideas, in effect, on the ground today that are causing the problems of the world. We see an ascendant forms of nationalist collectivism all over the world, including in this country, in the United States. And so, there's a lot of new, fresh thinking that's needed to try to combat those ideas and to advocate on behalf of their alternative, which is individualism and individual rights. That's just one example. But I should mention also that it was because she thought that ideas are what move the world. It's not just political ideas that move the world, because it's all of the major ideas of philosophy. And in philosophy, political philosophy is really just one important expression of more basic philosophical viewpoints. And so if you think, for instance, that if you advocate a version of nationalist collectivism, as Putin does, it's because you don't think that the individual has the power to think for himself, to make his own choices, to choose his own values, that he's in some way tied or bound to the values of others he's born with due to his blood, due to his genetics, things like this. And so to really understand what the alternative to that collectivist nationalism is, you really have to understand, why is it that, no, people do have that power. People do have free will. They have the power to use their own rational minds to figure out what's true and to figure out what kind of values to choose. And the fact is that when you look at our intellectual world, that is, when you look at what major thinkers and philosophers are saying, most of them are arguing that we don't have that power. Most of them are arguing that we're determined by either nature or nurture, that we don't have real free will, that our reason is some kind of construct, that we can't grasp reality first-handed by ourselves in an objective way. And so that's why, at the end of the day, the mission of the institute I work for, the Ayn Rand Institute, is philosophical and educational, because we're trying to educate people about some of these basic questions in philosophy, about why, about the importance of reason, about the importance of individual free will, about, before we get to the point of educating people about questions in ethics and politics, which we think are expressions and derivatives of those more basic questions. For her, it all comes down to the absolutism of reason. For Rand, it does.
So why you think our intellectuals have tendency to believe they are the solution to our problem, but not us?
Why do intellectuals
you cite that some intellectuals think they are the we should not think for ourselves. They should think for us. Why you think many intellectuals have that perception?
Well, that's a long story. And there's two major things to say, and each of these is just a snapshot of the full picture. But one is a historical story about the history of philosophy, and how the figures who are prominent and influential today were influenced by certain teachers that they studied from when they were in school, who were themselves influenced by still other thinkers and figures and philosophers. And the broader historical story here is about how in the 18th century, 17th and 18th century, there was this enlightenment in European thinking, where suddenly the powers of the individual to know and to act in the world were becoming recognized, in part because of the great achievements of the scientific revolution. And for a short time, philosophers were enchanted by that, and were advocates for it, and were trying to understand what made it possible. But for complicated reasons, that effort failed, and philosophers started to introduce various forms of skepticism, and started to challenge what they saw as the success of that period. And through the 19th and 20th century, then there was a long concerted attack on the efficacy of the rational mind. And to really answer the question of why, you'd have to go through a lot of the different arguments that these philosophers gave, which could take a while to do. But the point there is just there's a longer historical story to be told. The second point is that there's also, I think, a psychological story to be told about why certain thinkers give the kinds of arguments that they give. I mean, I don't think they're good arguments. Otherwise, I would not adopt the opposite position. And so anytime you have a thinker giving what amounts to a really bad argument for a really wrong conclusion, you have to ask the question, why would someone try to convince themselves of this really bad argument that has all these holes in it? And at the end of the day, I think the answer has to do with, well, it's a rationalization for something. It helps them hide something that they're insecure about. And if I had to sum it up in a really brief way, apart from some of the things I already mentioned about the history, the briefest thing to say is that, psychologically speaking, some people feel threatened by other people's freedom. They feel threatened by other people's ambition. They feel threatened by other people's courage, usually because other people's choices, other people's freedom reminds them of the choices they didn't make for themselves. And so they would rather not have that reminder. And they come up with arguments for why they shouldn't have to have that reminder. And there's a lot more that could be said about that. But really, what I'd recommend is if people want to learn more about it, take a look at Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged, where one of the things that's interesting about it, among many things, is there's a really in-depth psychological portrayal of the psychology of evil, of what motivates people to hate other people for their achievements. And it's a difficult thing to grapple with if you're not evil yourself, because you don't understand why would anybody want to be this way. Why aren't people content to make their own choices and choose their own path in life? And this is one of the difficulties that the heroes and the protagonists of that story themselves struggle with, because they don't understand what's motivating, in effect, the villains of the novel. They end up treating those villains with too much respect. They end up treating those villains as though they were rational and interested in living and surviving for themselves too. And turns out they're just not. And so Dagny Taggart and Hank Rearden, in one way or another, major characters in that story, struggle with this very question. And the way they resolve their struggle in many ways is what determines the outcome of the story and the plot.
I see. For a beginner on Ayn Rand ideas, somebody who want to learn more, what are the recommendation the Institute can provide as a guidance to allow the person to be more in touch with Ayn Rand's ideas?
Well, it really depends on someone's interests and where they are in life. But if I didn't know anything else about them, I just knew they were a beginner, probably what I would say is if you want a really short book, check out Anthem, which is a very short novella she wrote about the importance of individualism. Read it in an hour, maybe. If you have a little bit more time, I really do recommend The Fountainhead, which is the book that first got me interested in Ayn Rand's ideas. And it's a longer book. It's 600, 700 pages, but it's a gripping story about an innovative, independent architect, Howard Rourke, who goes up against the conventional standards of architecture in his society, also against the conventional value standards of his society. How he struggles not just with his enemies, but with the people who love him and the people he loves. And it's in many ways, I would argue, the great American novel.
I see. Mr. Ben, again, I will say thank you very much for your time. It has been quite a learning experience for me, and I will make sure that I share what I learned from you and from the Institute to my friends. Hopefully, in the future, if I have more questions, you will you will accord me your precious time, and I will ask further question to enlighten myself and my audience about Ayn Rand's philosophy and Ayn Rand's ideas. For me personally, she represents a person who helped me in many ways in my goals and being myself and pursuing my own path. And again, I want to say thank you.
You're very welcome. Happy to join you.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
Thank you.